host, Nick Jikomis, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Christoffer Clemmensen. Dr. Clemmensen is a professor who runs the Metabolism and Molecular Pharmacology research group at the University of Copenhagen, and his lab studies obesity and metabolism and a lot of the stuff in the brain and body related to that. So they're very interested in understanding, what are the circuits in the brain that control feeding behavior, what are, the gut peptides and the hormones circulating throughout the body that regulate appetite. They are trying to understand the mechanisms that underlie things like obesity, and they want to understand all that in order to develop new therapies for things like obesity and other metabolic disorders. And so we touched on all those topics. We talked about what obesity is and how it's measured. We talked about the causes of obesity and the various environmental factors like diet and exercise and lifestyle that contribute to it, and the various aspects of biology and genetic predisposition and all that stuff. We talked a little bit about some of the new anti-obesity drugs that have recently been developed and how they work by mimicking some of the actions of some of the gut peptides in our body and things like that. And we also talked about some of the research they've started to do looking at psilocybin and psychedelics and whether or not those might be relevant for developing therapies for things like obesity and metabolic disease. So if you're interested in metabolism generally speaking and the causes of obesity and metabolic disorders and how people are thinking about those things and how to treat them, and how, things like psychedelics might actually be a novel therapeutic modality for treating not just psychiatric conditions like depression or PTSD that we normally think about in the context of psychedelics, but actually these more metabolic type disorders and diseases, and whether or not that's going to be a promising area of research. As always, if you enjoy the content I'm producing here, please like, share, and subscribe wherever you are listening or watching. Check out mindandmatter.substack.com. You'll find links to my weekly free newsletter about the podcast, as well as some of my long-form writing that integrates a lot of the topics I touch on across episodes. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food-sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy-free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it with the first meal of each day, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure, and vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. And there's even evidence indicating that vitamin D deficiency is correlated with more severe cases of COVID-19 in those who get infected. Every time I go into the doctor each year for a checkup, I'm always told that vitamin D deficiency is very common and I should be supplementing on a daily basis. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase. And with that, here's my conversation with Dr. Christoffer Clemmensen.
I think the level of scientific detail you go into oftentimes, and that's also why I enjoy listening to it, because I actually feel like I learn a lot, because many of the topics are outside of what I do. So I've learned a lot, especially pertaining to psychedelics. So for me, it's been very useful.
Oh, great. Well, I'm glad you listened to it and you like it. Do you want to just start off by just telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what your lab does?
Yeah. So I'm Christoffer Clemmensen, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. And I run an academic lab it's called the Novo Nordisk Foundation Center for Basic Metabolic Research. And in my lab, we're predominantly interested in 2 things. One is to study and hopefully learn something about the biological mechanisms that regulate body weight, and then to take advantage of and or exploit such insights into designing and developing new pharmacological strategies for weight loss or weight loss maintenance. So those are the 2 key focus areas of my lab. but it's a very, I mean, it's a very basic oriented research profile we have. So we don't do, we do a few human intervention studies, but we predominantly use experimental animals for our work.
And you do a lot of stuff that's related to feeding behavior and weight and obesity. And obviously, I think everyone knows that obesity has been a growing problem across the globe, really, for quite some time now. Can you just give us a basic technical definition of what obesity is and how that is measured?
Yeah, so when we talk about obesity in the academic literature and clinical practice, etc., we typically use the body mass index as a measure of obesity. It's a relationship between our height and our body weight, and it's a very crude measure. But at the population-wide kind of level, it's very useful measure also because you can get a lot of data from hundreds of thousands of individuals because it's quite easy to measure people's height and weight. But it doesn't say much about the level of actual excess adiposity or body fat or level of fatness. So you can imagine a relative muscular individual will have a high BMI or body mass index, but could still be relatively lean with respect to the level of adiposity. So that's one of the caveats with this measure, but it's very useful at the kind of population-wide level, and it also basically goes on to show that we can easily see from those type of data that the rise in BMI has increased, or it has been dramatically increasing over the last decades in more or less all countries across the globe. So that is the typical measure we use when we look at when we talk about obesity. And then many studies, when we study weight regulation obesity, we typically use body weight as a primary measure. And then if we have access to different ways of measuring it, we would of course also use fat mass as a more direct measure of adiposity or body fatness.
Mm-hmm. So it's a fairly crude measurement, and it sounds like on the one hand, it is it's very convenient because all you need is someone's body weight and their height, very easy numbers to get. And it can tell you, give you a general sense of whether or not they're likely to be obese or not. But for an individual, you would want to get more precise measurements about their actual level of adiposity, the actual fat content of their body, how muscular they are, and so forth, to get a more sort of pinpoint accuracy readout of their metabolic health, basically.
Exactly, yeah.
And so obesity, there's been some talk recently about how we talk about it and what it is. Is obesity considered a disease, or is it something else? Like what is it in that sort of clinical nomenclature?
So that's a very good question, and I'm not sure I can answer it, but I can give it a try. So it depends. I think if you talk to the Danish healthcare system, I think they wouldn't agree to that it is a disease, but it's a disorder. That means that it predisposes to disease, but in and of itself, it might not be a disease. But but according to the US healthcare system, it might be characterized as a disease, or at least your kind of the FDA that is responsible for approving drugs for a variety of diseases in the US have at least approved specific drugs for treatment of obesity per se. So in that regards, you can say that it is by some healthcare authorities being characterized as a disease. But it's heavily debated, and I guess there are arguments in both camps that I think can be viewed as relevant. But I think there's no doubt that excess body fat is associated with a variety of severe adverse effects, and that it highly predisposes for a large number of other chronic diseases. But if obesity is a disease, in and of itself, I think that is still debated.
Okay, so people debate whether we call it a disease or disorder, but having excess body fat certainly predisposes you to a number of negative health outcomes, and I'm sure we'll talk about some. And this phenomenon that everyone can see around them of obesity becoming more and more prevalent over time, I want to get you talking a little bit about the causes of obesity. And it'll be sort of a vague question, and I'll sort of let us take the conversation wherever it goes. But, when we think about what causes obesity or just weight gain generally, we can talk about obviously the diet composition, the composition of your diet, as well as the total number of calories you're consuming. Obviously, physical activity levels are relevant. How active are you? How much are you moving your body? And there's also psychological factors that people often talk about, right? Like how much willpower or motivation you have to exercise or to regulate your diet. And then lastly, maybe, there's what we can just call like intrinsic biological differences between individuals. Different people have different genetics and different metabolism. Our enzymes, don't all work exactly the same way and so forth. Can you start to talk to people a little bit about how you think about all of these factors and how they interact, and if any of them are particularly important?
Yeah, so that's of course that's a big topic, and it's one of the things that's clear when you start diving into the causes of obesity is that you need to cover a variety of different fields of expertise. So you have your epidemiologist, and you have your cell biologists, pharmacologists, and etc. So it's a tough topic because it's very complex, right? So just one example is the contribution from socioeconomic factors. So there's a huge contribution from socioeconomic factors to obesity predisposition, and that's clearly a super complex component to study. And on the other side of the coin, you have your genetic factors that has been estimated, for example, from family and twin studies, etc., that the genetic component of our variability in body weight can be ascribed to up to 70%. So you have your genetic contribution, you have your food environment and your environment in general, including mental health, upbringing, socioeconomic status, education, and in some complex interaction between all of these components, we develop a certain body morphology, body weight, and a certain amount of body fat mass. So it's to a large extent genetically predisposed, but it's in the face of the environment we live in that we kind of realize that genetic predisposition, as for many other traits. So in that way, that's the easy explanation, right? That it's complex interaction between our genes and the environment, but that seems to also be the truth for the development of obesity or the variability in our body weight.
Mm-hmm. And what about like some of these intrinsic biological differences between people in terms of how their basic metabolism is working? And what I'm thinking about here is, I think we've all had experience in our lives with seeing people that we interact with and stuff, where there's certainly some people who don't put on that much weight. They don't have to work very hard to not worry about obesity or things like this. And there's other people who work really hard. They're careful about their diet. They are trying to exercise as much as possible, and they still struggle with weight gain. And it's striking that for some people it's relatively easy. For some people it's very hard. And for many people, they're somewhere in the middle. But, do we know what's kind of going on there for why some people are naturally lean and less prone to weight gain, and why some people can put on weight very, very easily, even when they're consuming a diet and they're active that would not make other people obese?
We don't know, but those are some of the most interesting questions in the field that you're alluding to here. So even in the most obesogenic environments, so environments where a large degree of the adult population is obese, you have individuals that remain remarkably slim. So why is it that some individuals are capable of staying very skinny or slim in these obesogenic environment? Are they equipped with a superhuman willpower, or do they have genes that favor their preference for certain foods, or do they have a really sensitive satiety system, meaning that they become extremely full or satiated quickly, or do they have like a super powerful or hypersensitive reward system that make them completely unreceptive to rewarding stimuli that are all around us, right? So those are, I think those are fair questions to ask, but I think those are also good examples with the conundrum between these obesogenic environments and individuals that remain slim. And conversely, you also have individuals that are very prone to develop excess adiposity in environments where there's perhaps not, where there's relative food scarcity, or where there's not a high abundance of energy dense and hyperpalatable foods. So we see both ends of the spectrum. And I think that exemplifies the interaction between our genetic predisposition and the environment. So I think the genetic predisposition, we must not underestimate in the variability we see in weight phenotypes amongst us. And it seems as if most of us, so we can say like estimate up to 2/3 of us, are actually to some extent predisposed to develop excess body fat. But the end of the day, it then depends on the environment that we're living in, and it's not only the food environment; it's also the environment that we are brought up in, right? How we're raised, and finally, it also adds to the complexity with the socioeconomic and the educational aspects as well, right? So again, it's a very vague answer, but I think it serves to underline the complexity of the biology also.
And so how much of this can we think of in evolutionary terms, in the sense that, for all of us, if you go back far enough in history, in our evolutionary history, we're descended from humans, from animals that didn't have the kinds of food surplus that we have today, that didn't have a choice oftentimes as to, when they could eat more or less. That was determined by the scarcity of the food in the environment. And it makes evolutionary sense that you'd want to bias an animal to accumulate fat in a natural environment where there's going to be, periods of feasting and periods of famines that you can't always control. So, it's sort of a safety. You could think of it, I guess, as a safety mechanism. It's better to be biased to put on excess body fat so that you can actually survive a period of famine or food scarcity than the opposite. And, as far as I know, most animals, most mammals at least, do often have that bias, right? I spent many years working with laboratory mice, and if you just leave them in the cage and don't give them much to do, and they have all the food that they can eat provided to them, they will put on body fat. Is that a reasonable way to think about it? Do we basically have that general bias in the population?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting topic. So I generally agree to that. The biological mechanisms that prevent us from lowering our body weight or from losing body fat seem to be extremely powerful. So we talk about these homeostatic forces or homeostatic mechanisms regulated by a region in the brain called the hypothalamus. They're very powerful in terms of preventing basically missing a single meal. For most people that feels uncomfortable. I know it's been popularized with this intermittent fasting and alternate day fasting, etc. But most people will find it uncomfortable skipping a single meal, despite that they have storage levels of energy that can make them go for weeks, if not months, right? So there's no storage danger with respect to skipping meals. Nonetheless, we've evolved a system that immediately somehow perceives this as an energy crisis or a organismal crisis if we start skipping meals. So the system, the defense system against weight loss is extremely powerful, you can say. But then what about the other side of the spectrum and weight gain? So that's a topic that we're actually also pursuing in my lab, and there's some conflicting observations. So if we overfeed humans as well as animals, meaning if we make them go through experimental paradigm where we introduce them to a controlled energetic surplus. So we explore what are the energetic requirements for either human or an animal in order for them to stay weight stable, and then we multiply this by a factor of 1.5 or 2. So we introduce a laboratory-controlled overfeeding experimental setting. Then we can control a certain amount of weight gain. We can do this in rodents as well as humans. But at the moment we then release or stop the overfeeding trial, we actually see the animals and humans lose weight back down again. So they find back to this homeostatic. Oftentimes it's referred to as a set point. We can also discuss that theory, but they seem to find back to the starting body weight level. And this is a little bit conflicting with this progression of obesity we see at a more global scale. So why is it that we see, as a species, we seem to put on more body weight, fat mass over years and decades, but we still seem to be equipped with this biological defense system against control overfeeding. So that is one of the things that we're trying to understand at the moment. But I think it's fair to say that the mechanisms that prevent us from losing body weight are more powerful or rigorous than the mechanisms that prevent us from gaining body weight. But we are equipped with mechanisms that actually prevent us from gaining excessive body weight and fat mass. I mean, there's nothing wrong. In a modern environment, you'd easily be able to consume the double amount of energy in each meal, but there's mechanisms in place to prevent you from doing this. So you do become saturated eventually. And if you for some reason go on a eating frenzy on a holiday or something like this, most people will experience to climb back down again, even though they may have gained a few kilograms. But evolutionary, to go back to your question, so I think there's been some arguments against this. It's sometimes referred to as the thrifty gene hypothesis, that our ancestors has been exposed to famines throughout our evolutionary history, and then this has pushed this selection pressure, genetic selection towards basically then eliminating genes that couldn't survive in this condition. But there's been some researchers have made calculations based on this and have argued that if that was the case, then we should all be prone to obesity. If you calculate back how many famines we've been exposed to, then we should have out-selected the genes. So there shouldn't be 1/3 of the population that would be lean today then. So that's one argument against this thrifty gene hypothesis, at least.
And so when we talk about these so-called defense mechanisms that regulate satiety, that make us feel full and prevent us from eating, even more than we do, we could be eating even more than we do. What are some of these mechanisms? What are some of these signals in the body that tell us to be satiated, that prevent us from overeating even more than we do? And are these sort of motivational circuits in the brain? Is there stuff released from the gut into the bloodstream? What are some of these things?
Yeah, so I think one of the most powerful signals is the most powerful signals are typically endocrine or hormonal signals. And one of the most well-known factors is a hormone called leptin that is produced by the adipose tissue from adipocytes in a quite tight relationship with the amount of adipocytes or size of adipose mass we have. And that signal serves to inform the brain about energy storage in the form of triglycerides in adipose tissue. So that is a quite well-characterized signal, and there are few human individuals that are so unfortunate to have mutations in the gene that encodes for leptin, or the receptor for which leptin interacts with in the hypothalamus of the brain, and these individuals become morbidly obese, unfortunately. So it also shows the importance of this single factor in the regulation of body fatness. So one of the key functions of this hormone leptin is exemplified if you try to calorie restrict to lose body weight. It seems as if the decline in circulating leptin is being perceived by the brain, and that will then promote excessive hunger, and also stimulate increased motivation. So it will also impact the mesolimbic system reward pathway to prioritize energy-dense, palatable foods. So you'd have a kind of food-seeking behavior to replenish this energy deficit, and that's one of the reasons for why it's so difficult to maintain on a certain dietary regimen, independent of your diet, basically, because it doesn't matter if you go on low carb or low fat or low whatever diet in order to lose weight. Eventually, a decrease in circulating leptin will be perceived by the brain as an energetic crisis, and that will then elicit a series of behaviors and programs towards basically eliminating this energetic crisis. So that's a very powerful signal. But there's, of course, also a series of other endocrine signals, including changes to thyroid hormone levels that are important for also sustaining energy expenditure. And we see also impacts on a lot of the well-known endocrine factors. Could be growth hormone axis, IGF, catecholamines, and insulin, glucagon, and some of the gut peptides as well. But the gut peptides are generally more well known for their kind of effects in between meals. So they're more these kind of short-term satiating factors that works in the postprandial state, or to eliminate meal or terminate meals during eating, for example. And then, speaking about signals that prevent us from gaining excessive body weight, those signals are unfortunately, or not unfortunately, because it creates work for us, but those signals are not that well described, and this is actually what we're trying to solve right now, or trying to understand what are the endocrine or hormonal regulators of this overfed state that actually brings weight back down again following a period of overfeeding. Typically, or many of these endocrine signals are then either coming from adipose tissue, the liver, the gut, or pancreas, and will typically signal in a subset of neuronal populations in the hypothalamus of the brain and or in the brainstem, and through feed-forward mechanisms that will impact our behavior.
So with leptin, it's a hormone. So it's released into the blood by actual fat cells. And it sounds like it's basically, straightforwardly related to the fat levels in the body. So the more fat cells you have, the higher the leptin levels are, and it's a satiety signal. So more leptin in the bloodstream means basically your body is telling your brain and the rest of the body, we've got a lot of energy stored up. We don't need to be so worried about food seeking anymore. So we can, put our resources towards other things. We've got all this energy saved up in the bank, and it's released into the bloodstream. It travels all the way to the brain. It is going to affect circuits that are involved in food seeking, and it's a hormone. We use hormones all the time. We use exogenous hormones all the time. Human growth hormone. Any number of other things that people use for various purposes. So can't we just use leptin as a treatment for obesity? Can't we just sort of inject people with leptin and they'll be less hungry?
So I'm pretty sure that when the group of researchers that discovered leptin in 1994, they stumbled upon this discovery it was actually decades of work. I'm pretty sure that was their hope or anticipation as well, that leptin would be a super powerful signal to imitate pharmacologically. But as it turned out, it seems as if the central leptin signaling is already to a large extent satiated, so it doesn't have much of an effect to add more leptin to the system, because the receptor signaling is already at its max. And whereas it seems as if the primary physiological function of leptin is actually in the lower end of the spectrum. So when your adipose tissue is for some reason lack of better word, shrinking, or if you somehow is in an energy deficit state. So the brain is more sensitive to sensing lower circulating levels of leptin than it is to to perceive higher circulating levels of leptin. So I think that was perhaps a big disappointment at the time, but there was some early clinical trials with recombinant leptin in the late 90s, but they were largely disappointing. That it showed very little promise with respect to weight loss. So that was more or less discarded around the turn of the century.
And is there an analogy here with something like insulin resistance? So when you talk about diabetes, we talk about people being insulin resistant, so their bodies don't respond to insulin in the appropriate way because something is metabolically broken that prevents their cells from responding in the way that they should. Can something like that happen with these satiety signals like leptin, where the body's producing a lot because you've got high fat content, but it's just not getting where it needs to go, or the body loses its ability to actually sense it, or something like that?
There is a large body of literature on that phenomenon, leptin resistance, but also resistance to a lot of other hunger or satiety signals. I think that it's still being debated whether that's a scientific detour or not, given what I was trying to explain before, is that it seems as if the leptin signal is already satiated, and it's not because of resistance at the central level or the receptor level that it's not as if the hormone doesn't work. It just doesn't help to add more. But there's a large body of literature on leptin resistance. So, and it's still, I think, an ongoing topic for many investigators. So I'm not going to also disregard it as a whole, but I think I just subscribe to the notion that leptin is more of a hunger than a satiety signal, meaning that it's the absence of leptin where you see the most powerful physiological effects, as opposed to the increase of normal levels of leptin, where you see very little physiological effects. So I think for me, that's at least the most rational explanation for that hormone at the time being. But there's a lot of interesting also cellular and molecular work being done on leptin receptor signaling in the brain. And another research area that I think is interesting is the idea of empowering leptin signaling in the obese state. So some people are trying to use polypharmacology or combination therapy as a way of, is there any way to empower or enhance leptin signaling so you somehow can get more satiating benefit for leptin signaling in the obese situation? I think that's still an interesting concept, but I think leptin resistance as an analogy to insulin resistance, I think it's not as clear cut as for insulin resistance in diabetes.
I see. So instead of thinking about leptin as the signal which just sort of linearly suppresses hunger, it's more like it unleashes hunger when it's not around. So
Exactly.
If you have some leptin, you don't need to be super hungry, but when it goes away, you better go find food. But if you've got some leptin around and you just add more, that's not doing what we would hope it does.
Exactly. And that's supported by the genetic models, both unfortunately humans that suffer from leptin deficiency or animal models of leptin deficiency. They become extremely sick and morbidly obese. So that shows the lack of the signal is really detrimental. But all the circumstances where we try and increase the signal, it doesn't seem to add much benefit.
And so it sounds like there's thinking that there are other factors circulating in the blood, other endocrine factors, other hormones potentially that help regulate satiety and food-seeking behavior or weight gain itself. What are some of these things, or why do we suspect there are these other factors circulating in the bloodstream?
Yeah, I think it's based on the work that has been done with this paradigm I was trying to talk a little bit about previously, with this overfeeding, experimental overfeeding paradigm. So we've people have been doing overfeeding studies for many decades. A lot of studies in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where they've done prolonged overfeeding studies, up to 100 days of controlled overfeeding. You see in some extreme cases 15 plus kilogram controlled body weight gain in these studies. But what is also apparent is that once you release people from this controlled overfeeding studies again, they lose body weight. And to my knowledge, it has not been uncovered what the mediators of this post-overfeeding weight loss, what the mediators of this response are. I think there's evidence to suggest, especially from the rodent literature, that it could be endocrine regulators. So it becomes a little bit technical, but there are these rodent studies that are termed parabiosis, where you basically join the circulation of two animals, so you make kind of a pair of siametic twin rats or mice. So you stitch them together on the side, so they're basically surgically connected in pairs, meaning that they share blood circulation. So all circulating hormones in animal A will travel to animal B and vice versa. And that system then enables you to examine if you do some type of intervention on animal A and it affects animal B, this is likely due to some type of circulating component traveling from A to B. And those type of experiments has taught us a lot about endocrine regulation of body weight. And in the context of overfeeding, it has been shown that if you overfeed one partner, you actually see the other partner lose a lot of body weight and fat mass in response to overfeeding of one partner, again suggesting that there's some factor released from the overfed animal to the non-overfed animal that then induces satiety and weight loss. So in my lab, we've actually we study both this type of intragastric or experimental overfeeding in experimental animals as well as humans. So the way we go about it is that we run these overfeeding trials, and then we kind of agnostically look at all tissues as well as circulating or plasma. And then we expose it to these more kind of novel omics technologies that enable you to an unbiased and perhaps systematic fashion to characterize previously unknown signals that could be mediating this effect. So it's a combination of an old intervention with novel technologies that we hope can help identify some of these circulating factors that we believe exist.
I see. So one of the ways that we know that these circulating factors exist is you can literally surgically attach one mouse to another mouse, almost like a Siamese twin. And if you take mouse A and you overfeed it and it starts to gain weight, the other mouse actually stops eating, which implies that something in the blood and the circulation is promoting satiety due to the overfeeding of the first mouse, and that actually causes the second mouse to lose weight.
Exactly.
And so when you do experiments in mice and you make them obese and you make them gain weight, in the literature you often read that mice were given a high fat diet. But I'm interested in a little bit more detail on what the diets are that drive weight gain most effectively in laboratory animals. Is it high fat, literally, like high saturated fat or unsaturated fat? How does that compare to the protein and the carbohydrate levels? What macronutrients tend to cause mice or other lab animals to most readily gain weight?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think it's an important question. If you follow some of the oftentimes heated debates on social media, such as Twitter, on macronutrient composition or distribution and the effects on human health and body fatness, you see oftentimes the criticism of the rodent studies is that, well, they have completely different dietary preferences, genetic predisposition, etc., which is also, of course, true. And it is also true because it seems if the easiest way to get a mouse fat is to introduce a relatively or fairly high fat diet. So it's a diet that oftentimes would have 50 to 60% of the energy coming from fat, whereas I think for most humans that would be probably too fatty of a diet, and it would not be the most palatable human diet. So to get an experimental animal fat, you'd give it a high-fat diet of 55 to 60% fat, and the rest coming from a mixture of sucrose, so that would constitute the carbohydrate, and some protein to ensure that it's not malnourished with respect to amino acids, so it can still also grow. And there's been done a very kind of rigorous study a few years back where some researchers basically did, I think, 20 plus, if not more, diets where they basically did all these kind of micro adjustments to the macronutrient distribution, and concluded that it's a really high fat diet that is the most kind of obesity promoting diet in experimental animals.
I see. So it is literally a high fat diet that makes them obesogenic, but there's also, it sounds like there's enough protein for them to meet their minimum amino acid requirements, but it's not high protein beyond that. And there's also a sizable proportion of that is carbohydrates, and in particular sugar. Yeah.
So I think the diet we use in my lab is oftentimes termed a high fat, high sucrose diet. It is very high fat. It's 58% fat, but the carbohydrate in the diet is comprised of sucrose. And in our hands, it's the diet that is the most efficacious diet in order to render the animals obese, as well as some of the other metabolic derangement that follows obesity, including glucose intolerance or pre-stages of diabetes, which we also like to study. So that is the most efficacious diet in our hands. Yeah.
Sorry, I was on mute. I want to hear more about your research to develop new tools to treat things like obesity and metabolic syndrome and things like this. But actually, before that, can you talk a little bit about what are the drugs that have been used or that are more recently been developed for things like obesity? I know I didn't look too much into it, but I know that there was something that was making a buzz recently about being a new anti-obesity drug. Can you talk a little bit about what that was and how that drug works and why we think that those mechanisms will be effective?
Yeah, so we talked about the failure of recombinant leptin to treat obesity around year 2000 or so, and basically up until very recently, we haven't had any effective weight loss therapies. But then as it turned out, a subset of drugs that were originally developed for treatment of type 2 diabetes turned out also to have a quite powerful effect on weight loss. And I think once the companies discovered that, they started then to optimize the weight lowering components of these compounds, and they are now being approved these years. I think one of them from a Danish company, Novo Nordisk, was approved in 2020 or 2021 by the FDA for obesity treatment. And then we have Eli Lilly is coming out with a drug that's already approved for type 2 diabetes and now being fast-tracked for obesity or weight loss. And these compounds are, compared to what we've had previously, extremely efficacious. So you see in a body weight loss of 15 to 20% over 1 to 2 year treatment period, whereas previously we had difficulties to obtaining 10% weight loss with the drugs that we had available. And the adverse effects were also previously much more severe than what you see with this new class of compounds. So these new drugs are analogs of peptides that are coming from the gut, the gastrointestinal system. Typically, they're built on a gut peptide called glucagon-like peptide 1, referred to as GLP-1. We produce this endogenously in response, and we secrete it in response to meals, but its half-life is extremely short, meaning that it's cleared by enzymes it's cleaved by enzymes in the blood within a few minutes, meaning that we basically clear it following meals extremely rapidly. But the companies have succeeded in making really long-lasting versions of these compounds by substituting some amino acids in the sequence, so they have half-life that makes them suitable for once weekly administration. So peptides that are based on these peptide analogs of these gut hormones, GLP-1, and then the Eli Lilly's drug, it's a dual-acting peptide on GLP-1 and another hormone called gastric inhibitory peptide, which is kind of a cousin to GLP-1. So they made a peptide that has dual-acting effects on the receptors for both GLP-1 and GIP, but there's a lot of resemblance between these compounds from these two companies, and this seems to really spreading also outside kind of academia and your normal practitioner. It seems as if it also goes into popular media, so you see a lot of celebrities praising these compounds now, and I think that's an interesting topic also to discuss. What are the implications of these apparently very efficacious compounds that are now entering the market?
Yeah, so glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1, these drugs are similar to this peptide that's produced in the gut. What is the normal physiological function of GLP-1?
So the primary physiological function is glucose-induced insulin secretion. So in response to a meal, it facilitates the ability of the body to absorb the nutrients, or to ensure that the nutrients are being taken up by the organs in relation to or in agreement with insulin-induced nutrient uptake. So insulin typically works on liver, fat, and muscle cells. So it enhances the ability of insulin to act on these tissues, basically by empowering insulin secretion. So its primary role is actually glucose-induced insulin secretion. And its effect on satiety, then, I think it's debated how much effect endogenous GLP-1 has on satiety, but it's very, very clear that the pharmacological versions work in the hypothalamus and of the brain and in the brainstem to elicit powerful satiety or lowering of food intake. So both rodent and human studies shows that these compounds, they just lower food intake tremendously. So that's, I think, one of the kind of happy coincidences, or the kind of the serendipity with this development, is that the long-acting versions are so powerful weight-lowering agents through their satiating effects in the brain.
Okay, so a major outcome these peptides have, and these drugs have, is to cause more insulin release. So okay, so this is not my area, so this might be a very basic question. So these drugs cause more insulin release, and that leads to satiety. Doesn't just consuming more calories also cause more insulin release? And if so, that confuses me.
Yeah, so these things are uncoupled. So the effects on glycemic control or glucose metabolism are through increased insulin secretion that will then more rapidly remove the circulating substrates from the plasma and send them out to respective tissues. But independent of the insulin, the GLP-1 directly works on GLP-1 receptors in the brain, which elicits powerful food intake suppressing effects through the same neurons that, for example, leptin work on, these POMC neurons in the hypothalamus and specific neurons in the nucleus of the solitary tract and the area postrema. So GLP-1 in and of itself works on these appetite regulating neurons in the brain.
I see. So GLP-1 goes all the way up to the brain. It works on circuits related to food-seeking behavior and hunger in the brain, and can promote satiety that way, in parallel to what it's doing sort of outside the brain and the rest of the body with respect to insulin and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so what's your view on, like, does the data for these drugs look as good as the internet buzz seemed to imply it was? Are you cautious in any way about how well these drugs are going to work? Do you think that this is the type of peptide receptor interaction that's ideal? What are your basic thoughts on how well this could work?
I mean, they're working very well, and they've been tested quite rigorously over the last many years. So the predecessors for some of these drugs were developed by the same companies and have been around. The first one was approved in 2014. Saxenda is liraglutide. It's another GLP-1 analog. They work very well, and the adverse effects are, I mean, they are for some individuals intolerable, but they're not severe as such. So the main adverse effects are nausea, and for some vomiting, and some report that this effect is transient, whereas others have difficulties living with this, and then will have to discontinue the drug. But so far they've been liberated from severe adverse effects such as development of other like severe kind of disorders. So just for example, some of the historical weight lowering agents would have neuropsychiatric adverse effects or cardiovascular adverse effects. So that's a no-go for new weight loss drugs. And these drugs seem to actually have positive effects on the cardiovascular system. So they seem so far to be clear with that regards. And a weight loss of 15 to 20% is actually quite decent. One thing to keep in mind is that for these compounds, as well as other compounds, for example, drugs we use to treat high cholesterol levels or blood pressure, etc., the moment you stop treatment, the weight will rebound again. So it's a lifelong treatment. It's not a cure. It's a treatment that will then counteract some of these homeostatic mechanisms that try to impose weight regain. So the body will somehow still be in a perceived energy deficit, but that is then actively being opposed by the drug. But once you then discontinue drug treatment, you'll unleash this homeostatic defense system again, and the weight will rebound.
One thing I want to ask you about, so we've been talking about, hormones and gut hormones that are relevant to metabolic health and that have long been known to regulate hunger and satiety. I want to talk about a neurotransmitter that'll help set us up to talk about some other stuff, and that's serotonin. So, people know serotonin first as a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's famous because of SSRIs, especially serotonin reuptake inhibitors that are used to treat depression. But as many people now know, there's a lot of serotonin in the gut. Serotonin does a lot more stuff than just, regulate mood and aspects of brain function. It's doing stuff all over the body. And in fact, a lot of the side effects from many serotonergic drugs can include things like metabolic effects. And so can you give people just sort of a basic overview maybe of how serotonin starts to tie into things like metabolism and weight gain and feeding? I know that there's some relevance when it comes to things like nausea and appetite. And, how do you think about serotonin as a metabolism and obesity researcher?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So it's not a topic that I have that we actively we have actually studied some of it, but it's not a neurotransmitter that are being that widely studied. There are some labs that are, of course, focusing on this, but I think one thing to be said is that there has been one drug on the market that have been working through serotonin 2C receptors. So one of the serotonin receptors, an approved weight loss drug. So that clearly emphasizes that the serotonin system is important for weight homeostasis, and that is, I guess, has also been known for decades. And I think another thing that I want to add in also perhaps to discussion is I think the clear interaction between oftentimes psychiatric disorders or such as or drugs that we use to treat psychiatric disorders, such as antidepressants or antipsychotic agents, that they most often has quite powerful adverse effect on weight gain or weight loss. Most often it's weight gain, emphasizing the interaction between perhaps not the disease pathologies, but at least the drugs we use to target for example, the serotonin system seems to influence also energy homeostasis. So there's a lot of evidence for the involvement of the serotonin system in many aspects of energy metabolism. Yeah, so there's at least some things to unpack there.
And what kind of what kind of psychiatric comorbidities do we see with obesity? So, for example, we can think of obesity as purely a metabolic phenomenon, like it has something to do with satiety signals in the brain, and the nuts and bolts of our cellular metabolism going off track somehow. But I would imagine that there's a lot of overlap on the psychiatric side. For example, someone might be overeating not because their metabolism is broken in some basic way, but perhaps because it's a response to depression or anxiety or something like this. How do we start to think about tying those pieces together?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the important challenges in modern biomedical research, is that we start to acknowledge that most of the diseases that we study are actually much more heterogeneous than we initially thought, or that we're currently kind of acknowledging in the way we study them. Is that I think there are many origins of obesity or weight gain, and for some individuals it would have a clear psychiatric origin, whereas for others it would be a clear-cut kind of endocrine origin, disruption in, for example, leptin signaling, whereas for other individuals it could have a mental underpinning that would lead to compulsive overeating or other kind of behaviors that somehow is then driving some type of altered eating phenotype. So I think that's one way of viewing it, is that we need to be better to segregate the obesity etiologies, basically. And that's something that we're not very good at the moment.
I know that, recently you've started to look at things like psilocybin and tryptamine psychedelics when it comes to their possible impact on feeding behavior and metabolism in mice. So can you describe what some of those results are, and why you even thought that was a relevant thing to test? Like, what even gave you the idea to look at something like psilocybin when it comes to feeding behavior?
Yeah, so I think the origin for this work, I would have to go on a little bit of a detour, but I'll try and be brief. So we're really interested in trying to develop drugs or pharmacotherapies that will have sustained or long-lasting effects on body weight. So as opposed to the current therapies that once you stop treatment, you see weight regain, we'd like to develop some therapies where you kind of readjust this defended level of body fat. We'd like to create therapies that enforces or renders the brain to defend a lower level of body fat and accept that as its new quote-unquote set point. And how do we do this? So here we kind of started to seek inspiration in developments within treatment of depression and addiction. And we noticed that some of the compounds that were emerging were antagonists of the NMDA receptors, such as ketamine, and also serotonergic psychedelics. And a kind of commonality for these is it seems with very, not necessarily single administration, but with very infrequent drug administration, you'd see long-lasting disease-modifying benefits, suggesting that kind of a synaptic changes to synaptic structure or neurostructural components might be able to sustain these kind of changes over a longer period of time. And a kind of our dream or vision was, imagine if we could do something similar to obesity or weight loss, if we could impose neurostructural changes that will then materialize in the form of a kind of lower level of defended body fatness. So that was the starting point. So we started actually exploring the NMDA receptor antagonist, and we saw some quite nice effects, and we're continuing to develop this. So we've now actually we've developed these peptide small molecule conjugates, where we use these gut peptides to target NMDA receptors specifically to brain regions of interest as a kind of Trojan horse strategy. So that's one of the key areas of work of the lab. But in parallel with that, we couldn't kind of let the idea go about the serotonergic psychedelics, and we were excited, I think, about kind of the broad spread of pleiotropic benefits of psychedelics for a multitude of diseases. And given some of the commonalities between addiction-like phenotypes and depression and obesity, we just went ahead and started to explore the effects of, we just then selected psilocybin, and then we explored the effects of psilocybin on eating behavior and weight loss, weight gain in mouse models of obesity, basically.
Okay, so I guess the idea is, if you have an obese individual, one way to think about what's kind of going on in the brain is the brain has accepted one set point for what the body fat content of the body should be. And in this case, it's something that's too high because it's going to have negative health consequences. So what you'd like to do ideally is come up with an intervention that sort of resets these circuits in the brain, so to speak, so that the set point for fat content is lower. And again, ideally, you'd want an intervention that makes that kind of reset in the brain so that you don't need to chronically be administering a drug or something, and the person then just has a brain that can naturally regulate its own feeding behavior without a continued intervention being necessary in the long term. So, the basic idea with these psychedelics, for many of the psychiatric applications, one of the remarkable things about them is that unlike other psychiatric drug treatments, they don't require chronic use. They're inducing some kind of neuroplastic change in the brain so that circuits are physically changing, and then you get effects that are persisting well beyond the administration of the drug. And so I think what you're basically saying is you'd like to have a drug like that with respect to obesity, because you don't want to be chronically administering something, and you want the brain to be sort of reset so that it can then handle itself.
Yeah, exactly. So that's at least, I think, ambitious goal or kind of holy grail within obesity therapeutics to develop. It will be a cure, basically, and it sounds a little bit maybe over ambitious, but I don't see why we shouldn't try and pursue this. And I think the devil is in the detail. I guess also probably you know better than me, but for the psychedelics, it's also not necessarily one treatment then you're cured for life. It could be perhaps less frequent treatments over a period of time, or some type of combinatorial therapy, either with it could be co-administration of another drug. It could be also psychological counseling, and I think we must be open to these type of other interventions for obesity treatment. It's great that we have these new drugs on the market, but I think we shouldn't stop innovating at this point. We must really continue to try and continue to develop more therapies, also in parallel with acknowledging the heterogeneity in the disease origin, right? So there will not be one size fits all in terms of weight loss treatments. And I think the final argument for this could be a viable strategy is the effect of the bariatric surgeries, so the obesity surgeries. We haven't talked about those, but they are remarkable in the sense that they seem to have this effect on readjusting the homeostatic level of defended body fatness, or this set point, if we should call it that. So that's at least one type of inspiration or something to aspire to mimic that effect with the pharmacotherapy. So it's single intervention that will have these sustained effects on lowering this defended level of body fat.
How do those surgeries work? Are you talking about the surgery where they basically go in and make someone's stomach smaller?
Yeah, so it's either the most well-known or most widely applied surgeries are the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, is a rerouting of the gastrointestinal tract, or a vertical sleeve gastrectomy, where you basically make the stomach smaller. So I think historically the idea was that they work because it's a physical restriction, but nowadays it's widely accepted that it's not the case. They actually work because they have influence on the secretion of some of these aforementioned gut peptides. So they seem to influence a long list of signals that are rising from the gut. So in response to, so basically you have some type of readjustment of the gut-brain axis and the communication between the gut and the brain, and that works basically quote unquote miracles in terms of weight loss maintenance. So that's really exciting, and I think there's been work trying to really dive into the details of this over the last 10-15 years, and there's been made some headway, but I still think we need to fully understand how they work so effectively. But it's not by just a physical restriction of the gut. I think that's clear that that is not the driver of the effect. It is probably through metabolic or endocrine mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. And do we know of any metabolic effects or effects on feeding behavior that psychedelics like psilocybin have? Is it affecting, and has anyone measured, changes in gut hormone secretion or food intake? And what do we know about that?
Yeah, so we tried in one paper we published in 2022, and I believe that's the first paper of its kind. At least we couldn't find other manuscript. We tried to do a very comprehensive and broad characterization of at least psilocybin and its effect on animal physiology and metabolic regulation. So we examined the effects of both microdosing and single high dose administration in genetic models of obesity, dietary models of obesity, models of pharmacology-induced weight regain, diet-induced weight regain, palatable diet preference, and a series. We tried to basically create a whole bunch of behavioral and physiological tests, and then do a broad kind of characterization of the effects of psilocybin on these parameters in the mice. And somewhat disappointingly, we didn't find much in the mice. We saw that it had a quite convincing effect on lowering sucrose preference, which is sometimes used as a kind of hedonic feeding test. But I also have, I don't know if it's very surprising. If we believe, I don't know if we, but what is the driver of the benefits of psychedelic therapy in humans? Do we need the psychedelic experience, or is it part of, do we need this highly evolved prefrontal cortex to have the full clinical benefit? If so, then the rodents are really poor model for studying this. So I think, to my knowledge, there are no data to find with respect to psychedelic therapy in humans and exploring eating behavior, weight regulation, or anything like this. So I think it would be extremely exciting to do a human study, perhaps with a binge eating disorder type of setting, and explore the effects of a psychedelic drug on that disorder.
Yeah, interesting. So what kind of things are you guys working on today in the lab? What are some of the big questions that you're pursuing right now?
Yeah, so I've already touched upon a couple of those. So one of them is this targeting of the postsynaptic plasticity in order to introduce sustained effects on body weight through pharmacological means. And we study the molecular biology of neuroplasticity in order to better understand what are the targets we want to go at pharmacologically. So we're really interested in studying kind of the nitty-gritty of synaptic connectivity in these brain regions that are important for appetite control, hopefully trying to come up with kind of next generation weight-lowering pharmacotherapies. That is one big focus area. And then we're really excited about this overfeeding intervention, and we really believe that it could hold promise to identify unknown circulating factors or hormones that could be also mimicked pharmacologically, that we don't have to mimic them, but at least uncover aspects of energy metabolism or energy homeostasis that we don't know as of now. So we believe that the combination of these overfeeding intervention with new methodologies could really unveil some new insights into energy homeostasis. So those are two primary areas of focus that we're really working on in the lab. And then we have a series of other side projects, but those are the main focus areas.
Mm-hmm. And so as someone who, your whole career is studying obesity and metabolic health and all this stuff, how has your work and your studies over the years influenced your own life in terms of, have you changed your diet at all based on stuff that you've learned? Are you very particular or disciplined about certain aspects of your own metabolic health? How do you think about all this as a scientific expert in this stuff?
Yeah, of course, I'm the scientific, it's, I think about the science of obesity from when I wake up to when I I go to bed. So of course it somehow is also there in context of my own life. But I think it actually, because I don't know if maybe it's an excuse, but because I believe in the role in the fact that genetic susceptibility and the environment I'm positioned in plays such a big role in my food choices and my eating patterns and how I live my life. I acknowledge that I'm just kind of a slave to society that I'm surrounded by. So I think I eat completely normal, and I try to prioritize healthy eating, and I try to stay active. But I think that's what most people do. But I think in general, I think we overstate the role of the individual and the individual's kind of idea about who you are and how you want to impose self-control or willpower over your own life, and underestimate the power of the biological mechanisms that come into play when we in terms of eating and weight regulation.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I want to ask you too is, so when you talk about experimental animals, so you're studying mice or rats or something like this, if you give them that high fat, high sugar diet that we talked about before, they will put on weight, they can become obese. What are the best ways in lab animals that they lose weight? To what extent can that be driven purely by giving them like an exercise wheel, or to what extent does another diet get them back to their starting weight? And if so, what is the composition of that diet?
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing we joke about quite often is that we've cured mouse obesity thousands of times. So it's quite easy to cure obesity in the mouse because they're actually extremely sensitive to these gut hormones we talked about before. So if you give them one of these modern drugs, you can more or less cure their obesity. But it's the same as with humans. Once you stop treatment, and if you maintain them on this high fat, high sugar diet, they will go back up again. But they're just a little bit more sensitive to the pharmacology, perhaps because we can dose higher. If you give them an exercise wheel, you'll see a change in body composition. You'll see a decrease in fat mass, perhaps an increase in lean mass, but you will not shred a lot of adipose mass. So as for humans, exercise is good for more or less everything you can think of, except for lowering your body weight. So there's so much evidence that exercise benefits more or less all types of chronic disorders, except it's very inefficacious for weight loss. Same goes for lab animals. You can maintain them on a high fat, high sugar diet, and then you can switch them to this boring rodent chow diet. They'll lose a lot of weight because, again, it's their genetic sensitivity in the environment we position them in. And if they just have access to one diet, they're actually capable of lowering body weight compared to on the high fat diet. But if you then reintroduce the high fat diet, they'll go back up again. So in some ways they're quite good. The mice and rats are quite good model for studying human energy metabolism, and they're much more predictive than for studying your typical brain disorders, so neuropsychiatric disease, etc., where they have much less predictive value, right?
Mm-hmm. So you can make an obese mouse, you can give it one of these drugs that we've spoken about, and they're actually highly effective. So you will cure the obesity effectively, meaning specifically that the weight of the mouse will go down. My next question is, what if you just do that persistently? So for an extended period of time, you take a formerly obese mouse, you give it the anti-obesity drug, which mimics some of these gut peptides, and its weight goes down. But presumably, if it has the same diet available to it, it might be eating less, but it's still eating that high fat, high sugar diet. In other words, the mouse can persist in its eating habits, maybe eating less overall, with this drug doing what it does. I would imagine that the mice still have maybe some metabolic issues that come from continuing with that high fat, high sugar diet. Has anyone looked at that and seen, other aspects of metabolic health and what happens to them in the presence of taking this drug?
Yeah, good point. I mean, if you weight match a group of animals on a healthy chow diet versus a high fat, high sugar diet, so they're matched in body weight, I would assume that we'll be able to detect some metabolic defects in the animals that are maintained on a high-fat, high-sucrose diet. They'll probably be a little bit less insulin sensitive. They may have slight hypercholesterolemia and some other defects. I would be pretty sure that we would see that effect. I can't, from the top of my mind, recall someone having done this type of study, but I would be certain that would be the case. So there is a direct effect on very unhealthy diet compared to a healthier diet in the weight matched condition, at least in the rodent. I think we'll be able to see that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, my concern with some of these new drugs would simply be that, if they're very effective at the weight loss component of this specifically, that's great. But what if, we're just sort of enabling people to persist in the eating habits that caused the obesity to begin with. And so now we're just sort of papering over the problem where they might eat less and they might lose that weight, which is a good thing, but they're still eating the same diet composition that caused the problem to begin with. Is there any concern about that?
So it's a good point. I think in general, there's some evidence that the compounds also affect macronutrient or eating preferences toward a healthier diet. But on the other hand, you can also imagine a circumstance where you introduce a compound to individuals that live in an environment where they mostly have access to fast food restaurants.
Yeah.
And then they would have to eat less of that fast food as compared to what they normally do. So you can imagine that you could see a state of malnourishment or malnutrition, insufficient intake of vitamins and minerals, etc. So that, I think that's a fair kind of caveat to envision. But I think in general, there are reports that people actually prefer healthier choices when they're on the drug.
Have people looked at food preference shifts in response to this GLP-1 drug in rodents? And if so, what are those?
There are a few studies. I think in general in rodents, you typically see changes in macronutrient preference. From the top of my mind, I'm pretty certain that you see a decrease in the preference for fat, given that is most preferred macronutrient in the rodents, at a slight increase then in protein and carbohydrates. But I'm not 100% sure. But it has been done with many of these drugs and these type of macronutrient preference assays in rodents.
I see. So based on the information we have now, it's not simply that these drugs are decreasing the amount of calories consumed. They also seem to be inducing a shift in the macronutrient preference, the things that you want to eat.
Yeah. I mean, eventually eating, to translate a sensation of hunger has to be, you have to go through motivation and actually locomotion in the end to realize this. So the hunger satiety circuits are heavily interconnected with motivation and reward and similar circuits, executive circuits in the brain, right? So there is interconnectedness between these circuits. So I think anything that would stimulate kind of canonical hunger in the hypothalamus would also have an impact on increasing the food motivation in an animal and the preference for energy-dense, palatable foods as well. So that's typically highly interconnected.
I see.
And vice versa, if you suppress this pathway, you're also likely to suppress kind of the preference for these type of hyper-palatable foods.
I see. Well, we talked about a lot already. Is there anything that you want to reiterate or touch on before we go?
I'll probably come to think about a ton of things afterwards, but I guess that'll be too late. No, but the worst case or best case, we'll have to do a follow-up.
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to maybe just leave people with, what's a really exciting question that your lab or other labs are pursuing right now with respect to obesity and metabolic health that is a major question that we don't know the answer to right now, but you think we will understand in the next few years?
Oh, wow. I guess I'm most absorbed by how the brain defends these different levels of body fatness. What is it that makes the brain for person A defend 150 kilogram body weight with, I don't know, 70 kilograms of body fat, whereas for person B defends a very, very lean phenotype? And why is it so difficult to to readjust this defended level of body fat, although it being pathological for one individual. I think that has been a topic of interest for many decades. So I probably won't be solved within a few years, but I think that still is what fascinates me the most is this kind of homeostatic defense of body weight and body fat.
All right. Well, Professor Clemmensen, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
This episode is supported in part by the Amino Company. They specialize in making science-backed amino acid products that you can mix into any drink. Their products contain a mixture of essential amino acids, the building blocks of proteins in the body, as well as other nutrients including minerals like iron and electrolytes like potassium. Your body is constantly repairing damage, and your muscles and tissues need the right mix of amino acids and nutrients to do this effectively. One thing I like about Amino Co. is they actually conduct clinical trials to determine what their products really do. They have a variety of formulations engineered for different purposes, and my personal favorite is one called Heal, which has been shown to be 3 times more efficient at triggering muscle growth and repair than other protein sources. It helps maintain healthy inflammation levels and preserve muscle mass during periods of inactivity. I mix this product into the water bottle I bring to the gym and consume it before, during, and after my workouts, and I have felt a noticeable difference in my performance during those workouts and my recovery times from soreness and fatigue afterwards. Their products are keto-friendly, soy-free, vegetarian or vegan, gluten-free, and non-GMO, so they are compatible with almost any diet or lifestyle. You can support the podcast and try Heal or any of their other products by using the discount code MIND when you visit aminoco.com/mind. You will get 30% off your purchase. If you work out regularly or do intensive exercise, I recommend trying AminoCo's products. I get a lot of companies reaching out to me about advertising, and I only end up using and liking a small percentage of the products that I see. So check out aminoco.com/mind and use the code MIND to try these products today for 30% off.